ingenuity, creativity, and innovation.
Passion, purpose, and the pursuit of excellence.
Mateship, inclusion, and the idea of a fair go.
At Chevron, we call it human energy,
which also powers the Australian of the Year Awards.
Celebrating the achievement of outstanding Aussies.
Will inspire us and challenge us to make our own contribution
to creating a better Australia.
So while each of our stories may begin in different places,
we are bonded by a common future
that we will create together.
Because we are all part of the story.
So go on, nominate someone you know today
at australianoftheyear.org.au.
Good afternoon and welcome to another in our series of Inspiring Australians Lunch with Leaders events. I'm Anne-Marie Farley, General Manager Programs here at Auspire, and we're delighted you've joined us. Just a quick piece of housekeeping. We're going to mute everyone's microphones to reduce any sound issues. So if you do need to contact us at any time during the presentation, please use the chat box located at the bottom of your screens. We'd also like to advise you that this session will be recorded and Auspire may use it for promotional purposes and or to share with our networks and partners at a later stage. Auspire, the Australia Day Council WA, acknowledges our first Australians, the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia. We recognise their continuing culture, their contribution and connection to land, waters and community, and we pay our respect to their elders, past, present and emerging. We extend a special welcome to those joining us today from our regional areas, and I think we also have a few from interstate, which is wonderful. In particular, we acknowledge Auspire Chairman Bradley Woods, board members David Hinton, Michael McPhail and Rabia Sadiq, current WA Australian of the Year Annie Fogarty and WA local hero Susie Urbaniak, and many of our family of Australian of the Year alumni. Thank you all for joining us. Welcome also to the team at Chevron. In delivering this event today, we're fortunate to have the support of Chevron, which has recently joined the Australian of the Year Awards program as Inclusion and Diversity Partner. Our introductory video featured Chevron staff encouraging nominations for the 2021 Australian of the Year Awards. And I encourage each of you to consider an inspiration individual and submit a nomination for them at australianoftheyear.org.au because we can't recognise anyone without a nomination. Today we're delighted to present two wonderful community leaders whose exceptional expertise and contribution to our nation was recognised through the 60th Australian of the Year Awards in January this year. We'd normally be hearing from them at personal appearances around the country, but the current situation brought about by the COVID-19 virus with social distancing limitations has seen significant changes to the way we're able to deliver such opportunities. We're thrilled to bring these two medical pioneers to you today on a topic that affects us all, sugar. Each of them will speak, and we hope you'll drop your questions in the chat room, and we'll endeavour to get through as many of those questions as possible at the end of their presentations. So to begin today, we welcome Dr. James Muecke. Dr. James Muecke AM, the 2020 Australian of the Year, is an accomplished eye surgeon who co-founded Sight for All, a social impact organisation aiming to create a world where everyone can see. Sight for All's comprehensive and sustainable projects are now impacting the lives of over 1 million people each year. He's spearheading the sugar tax movement in Australia, working to campaign against the dangers of excessive sugar consumption. And if he's successful, I'm sure I'm going to be a major contributor to that tax, James, so thanks very much. James is an inspiring social entrepreneur and is committed to humanitarian endeavours and manifesting positive change. Please welcome from his home in South Australia, Dr. James Muecke.
Thanks so much, Anne-Marie. I'm getting a bit of feedback, actually. That's good. Yeah, wonderful. Thank you. Yeah, thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you to the whole team at Auspire for inviting myself and John to come and speak today. And a big shout out to John, fellow recipient, doing an amazing job over there in WA. So I'm just going to share my screen now so that we can get started. So as Anne-Marie said, I'm an eye surgeon, and actually I've been an eye surgeon now for 30 years. And for 30 years, I've been dealing with the consequences that diabetes inflicts on the eyes. In fact, every year I'm seeing more and more people who are losing vision, going blind even due to this disease, and in particular type 2 diabetes, which makes up 90% of cases. It's a preventable dietary disease related to the consumption of too much sugar in our modern diet. In 2018, I met a man whose story had a really powerful impact on me. His name is Neil Hansel. He's an everyday Aussie bloke with a wife and 4 kids. He constructs light machinery for a living, and he also has type 2 diabetes. And a few years ago, at the age of 50, diabetes changed his world forever. Unfortunately, he neglected his disease and he paid the price. He went to bed one evening with normal sight and woke up the next morning blind in both eyes. One of my colleagues worked really hard to try and retrieve his sight. Unfortunately, it was too late. Neil was to spend the rest of his life in darkness. He lost his driving license, he lost his independence, and he lost his ability to see the beautiful smiles on the faces of his wife and his grandkids. This is a picture of Neil's wife and 2 of his grandkids. This is how he should see them, and this is the reality. Neil has been irreversibly blinded by sugar. And Neil is not alone. He's just one of over 100,000 Aussies with sight-threatening eye disease due to diabetes. So how does diabetes threaten the sight? Well, it damages the blood vessels throughout the body, including the retina, which is the light-sensitive layer of tissue that lines the inside of the backs of our eyes. This is the picture of the central vision area of the retina in a patient with diabetes. And this is that same eye a short time later. Diabetes can cause bleeding inside the eyes that can take away the eyesight in an instant and sometimes permanently. The important point here is that nearly all of the loss of vision and blindness, something like 98%, is preventable or treatable. And yet to avoid the blinding consequences of this disease, patients with diabetes need to have their eyes checked on a regular basis. But we know of the 1.7 million Aussies with this disease, more than half are not having their regular, all-important, sight-saving eye checks. And that's why it's become now the leading cause of blindness amongst working-age adults in this country. It's also the fastest growing cause of blindness amongst Aboriginal people. So for me, as an eye specialist, to see people who are going needlessly blind makes me really upset. But what makes me angry is that we're seeing life-changing and life-threatening consequences of a disease which in itself is entirely preventable. Type 2 diabetes was virtually non-existent back in the 60s. These days, we're seeing close to 250 new cases every single day. So today, I'd like to talk to you about type 2 diabetes, how it arises, why it's a growing epidemic, and I'd also like to look at some strategies to curb this rising tide of a condition which is a serious threat to our society and to our health system. So I mentioned that type 2 diabetes is related to the consumption of too much sugar in our diet. So when we talk about sugar, we often think of what you see here on the screen, which is table sugar or sucrose. And sucrose is the most common sugar additive. But it's important to remember that there are a number of other sugars, in particular the refined carbohydrates, which I call sugar in disguise. And these are products such as white flour, white rice, and white potatoes, and the foodstuffs made from them. Refined carbohydrates are pretty much pure starch. And all starch is simply a long chain of glucose, which is broken down into glucose when it reaches the gut. So you're ingesting refined carbohydrates, you're pretty much ingesting pure sugar. So let's look again at sucrose, which is made up of 2 elements, 50% glucose and 50% fructose. And the body handles each of these in a different way. So let's look at them each in turn. So firstly, glucose. When glucose is absorbed into the bloodstream from the gut, it triggers the release of the hormone insulin from the pancreas. And the insulin helps move the glucose into every cell of our body, whether it's either used as an energy source or stored for later use. With excessive and prolonged sugar intake, the cells become full of glucose and eventually they can take no more in. And despite a rise in insulin, they reach their capacity and then there's an overflow of glucose, which is then ultimately taken up by the liver. Initially, that glucose is converted to glycogen, which is stored by the liver. But when the glycogen stores become exhausted, the liver starts turning the glucose into fat. and that fat is actually exported away from the liver, where it's stored in healthy fat cells around the body. So it's a type of protective mechanism. But when the production of fat by the liver outstrips its ability to be exported away, the liver then starts to take on the fat, and we develop what's called a fatty liver. So this is a picture of a fatty liver. You know what a normal liver looks like. It's normally a deep dark red colour. So this liver is yellow because it's suffused with fat. Now, a great example of a fatty liver comes from the French culinary delicacy, foie gras. And this is created by force-feeding geese refined carbohydrates in the form of a high-starch cornmeal. So these poor, unsuspecting creatures can develop a fatty liver within 10 to 14 days. In humans with excessive fructose intake, they can actually develop a fatty liver within a couple of months. So let's then look at fructose. Fructose is that molecule of sucrose, which gives sugary products their sweet flavour. It's not recognised as a foodstuff by the body. It doesn't trigger the release of insulin. It actually suppresses the appetite control system. And when it hits the liver, after being absorbed into the bloodstream, it's converted directly to fat. So it's actually much more toxic than glucose in giving rise to a fatty liver. So this is a pathological specimen of a normal healthy liver. You can see the densely packed cells. And here we have a fatty liver. You can see it's distended, and those white spaces are the cells which are just full of fat. Now, it's a complex metabolic process, but ultimately type 2 diabetes arises on average about 13 years after we develop insulin resistance and the beginnings of a fatty liver. In children, however, you can develop diabetes, type 2 diabetes, within a couple of years. So what happens is that eventually the fat stores in the liver become full and the liver can store no more. So it then starts to export that fat away from the liver, and it's actually exported as triglyceride, which is harmful to the body. And the high triglycerol level in the blood combined with a high insulin level leads to the formation of fatty plaques, which then block the blood vessels. And that's what gives rise to the many life-changing and life-threatening complications of this disease. So blockage of the fine blood vessels throughout the body can lead to impotence. It can cause numbness and tingling or even pain of the hands and feet. And it can also give rise to kidney failure. And kidney failure needs filtering of the blood through dialysis up to 7 hours a day, 4 days a week. In fact, in Australia, there are about 60,000 hours of time spent on dialysis for patients with type 2 diabetes. So that's a huge amount of time that's lost to family and loved ones, to your work, or to the things that you love to otherwise do. Blockage of the major blood vessels in the legs can lead to gangrene. And this is a picture of a gangrenous foot in someone with type 2 diabetes. And such a foot obviously needs to be amputated. And so in Australia, every year there are over 4,000 amputations performed for type 2 diabetes. And here's our friend Neil Hansel in hospital the day after his 9th amputation over a 14-month period after he'd gone blind. In fact, this was only in March this year. And poor Neil has also had a heart attack. And diabetes can also cause stroke. And so this is a deadly disease. In fact, it's the 6th biggest killer in our society. And it plays a critical role in the development of the 3 major killers in our society, being heart attack, dementia, and stroke. It's also a very expensive disease, costing our health system over $20 billion every single year for the treatment of this condition, also the hours spent of lost productivity. So what can we do about this? Or why did it arise actually in the first place? Well, humans are hardwired to love and seek out sweet things. It's an ancient survival mechanism that helped our early ancestors to survive extended periods of fasting, which were common in early humans. Prior to the 1600s, sugar was an expensive commodity. It was the domain of healers and holy men, and it was an indulgence that could only be afforded by the wealthy and the powerful. Over the next 300 years, though, the rising availability and popularity of sugar due to the booming sugar trade led to diminishing costs, turning sugar from a luxury item to an everyday necessity. Things took a turn for the worse, though, in 1980 when the Dietary Guidelines for Americans was released. In the decades after World War II, there had been noted a rise in heart attacks, and On no scientific grounds, it was presumed that the heart attacks were due to the blockage of the arteries due to a fatty diet. And so it was recommended that we reduce our fat to 30% and increase our carbohydrates to 60%. And rather than seeing a downturn in heart disease began to soar, and along with it, type 2 diabetes. In fact, since 1980, there's been a fourfold increase in type 2 diabetes globally, and this has been even more profound in some countries and communities. In Australian Aboriginal people, there's been an 80-fold increase in type 2 diabetes since that period, and something that I find deeply concerning. And I have no doubt that a diet that's high in sugar, refined carbohydrates, and highly processed foods is driving this. And something I also found deeply concerning is that we're now seeing type 2 diabetes in kids. This is something that we used to call maturity onset diabetes. In Australia, there are now over 1,100 Aussie children and teens with type 2 diabetes. And this is actually a worldwide phenomenon. In 2001, less than 3% of all cases of diabetes worldwide was due to type 2 diabetes. And in just 10 years, that has risen to almost half. Okay, so what are we going to do about this clearly major and growing problem? If we're going to call type 2 diabetes a dietary disease, then it should be as simple as reducing the sugar and refined carbohydrates in our diet. There should be a dietary cure. But there are a number of confounding factors that make this a more difficult thing to achieve. And I call it the 5 A's of sugar toxicity. And these are addiction, alleviation, accessibility, addition, and advertising. And I'd like to go through each of these in turn. So firstly, addiction. Sugar is highly addictive. It's been shown to be as addictive as nicotine. In fact, its consumption activates the reward center in our brains, leading to the release of the neurotransmitter dopamine. It's what makes us feel good. It's what makes us want to do it again. And it's what gives us those cravings. And like drugs, the more you consume, the more you need to give you that feel-good hit. It's a vicious cycle that's actually really hard to break. Second A is alleviation. We often use sugar to alleviate stress or to make us feel better when we're down. When we're experiencing anxious times like we've all been through recently, the brain releases the stress hormone cortisol, and so the brain needs to balance that up with the release of dopamine and other feel-good chemicals, and sugar does a really good job of that. The third A is accessibility. Sugar is cheap, and sugar is quite literally everywhere these days in our lives. You can't walk into most service stations without being confronted by a wall of confectionery. You can't check out from most supermarkets but without being enticed by half-price soft drinks and chocolates. In fact, a recent study has shown that 90% of all food at checkouts is discretionary junk food, and that 30% of that junk food is actually on sale in any one week in our major supermarket chains. Fourth A is addition. An astronomical amount of sugar is added to our food and drinks, something in the order of 75%. And this is particularly problematic in remote communities where sugary and food and drinks are in abundance, and fresh and healthy food is often scarce and expensive. And the final A is advertising. Our world is flooded with TV commercials and ads for sugary products, often in the most insidious of ways. And this has been going on for decades. So how are we going to deal with this? Well, to me, it's going to take a resilient approach that actually attacks these 5 A's of sugar toxicity. So once again, let's look at each of these in turn. For addiction and alleviation, it's about being aware, personally aware that sugar is highly addictive and that we're using it to alleviate stress. And there are a number of strategies for each of these A's, but I didn't feel we have time for that today. And I really wanted to focus on those other 3 A's of sugar toxicity, accessibility, addition, and advertising. And these are really about accountability, and particularly accountability of businesses, of industry, and of government. So let's then look at these. So firstly, accessibility. And there are a number of strategies that we can use here. I was in the Adelaide Medical and Dental School quite recently, and I saw these 2 vending machines, and they were quite literally full of sugary products. So I wrote to the school. In fact, I've written to all the universities in South Australia, encouraging them to remove all of the sugary products from such vending machines. And of course, removing sugary products from checkout counters and supermarkets and stores would be a fantastic thing to see, because it's quite literally preying on our addictions, and particularly preying on the addictions of children and of the disadvantaged in our society. The 4th A is addition. I can barely read those nutritional labels on the packets of food, let alone understand them. And they certainly don't tell us how much added sugar is contained within. We have a 5-star, so we have a health star rating system, which is flawed. It's flawed because it's voluntary. And what organisation would voluntarily put a low-level rating on a product that it's trying to sell? So currently, there are only about 30% of manufacturers that have the health star rating system. It's also flawed because a number of unhealthy products get a healthy rating, and orange juice is one of these. A glass of orange juice has almost as much sugar as a glass of cola. Now, the health star rating system has recently been reviewed and the recommendations have been released this week. And I understand they're trying to encourage a 70% take up of the star system. And if they don't achieve that, they may well be mandating it. And I'd like to see a clear labelling system on the packets of food and drinks as to how much added sugar is contained within. And I've actually written recently and lobbied to the National Health and Medical Research Council and also to the Department of Health to reduce the amount of refined carbohydrates that you can see in our Australian Guide for Healthy Eating, our Australian Dietary Guidelines. And also there are quite a number of significantly sugary products in this guide which should be removed. And fortunately, Greg Hunt on Friday has already announced that they're going to be looking at the guidelines in the near future. So that was really wonderful to see. And this is where the contentious issue of taxing comes in. And there's some solid evidence and good reasoning behind it. In the 10 years leading up to 2017, sugary drink consumption increased in Australia by 30%. Sugary drink consumption has most certainly been linked to type 2 diabetes in a number of studies. And a number of studies in a number of countries has shown that the levy on sugary drinks also reduces purchase and consumption. So it certainly makes sense to me. In fact, a 20% levy on sugary drinks in Australia would raise over $600 million, which could be used to fund health awareness initiatives and the inequalities that exist in our society. So finally, advertising, and once again, a number of strategies here, but one of the obvious ones would be to remove TV commercials for sugary products during those hours when our kids are watching. Also, removing ads for sugary products from government buildings and services such as trams and trains and buses. And we need to see a broad strategy to raise awareness amongst the public of the multitude of health dangers of sugar, not just type 2 diabetes, but also tooth decay. Sugar is the leading cause of dental caries in our society. We also need to see positive messages. We need to see that type 2 diabetes is preventable and it's also reversible in many people. In fact, a recent study showed that more than half of the people who were enrolled in that study reversed their type 2 diabetes in a 10-week period by adopting a low-carb, low-sugar diet. And we also need to hear the very important message that natural fats in our diet have never been shown to cause cardiovascular disease. Not just the products that you see here, but also whole-fat dairy, unprocessed meats, eggs, and dark chocolate. They've never been shown to be associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular disease, a really critical piece of information. And we need to see hard-hitting strategies. TV commercials such as this one that I created for Sight for All a couple of years ago.
I should have kept my medication up and I should have followed the plans that were given to me by my doctors. I woke up one morning completely blind. Thought I was dreaming, went back to sleep for an hour, woke up and I was still completely blocked off. My wife's face when we went to bed. That was the last clear image I had.
It's a devastating story, isn't it? That ad played on Channel 7 nationally for about 6 weeks in late 2018, but it played as a community service announcement, so it was probably only seen at 2 o'clock in the morning. I believe that ads such as these need to be played across all of the stations for extended periods of time and during prime time. To me, it's all about education. These days, would you leave a pack of cigarettes on the kitchen counter for your kids to enjoy? Absolutely not. So why would we leave a bowl of sugary treats? We need to replace that bowl of sugary treats with a bowl of nuts, for example. We need to educate our kids, and yet we can't educate our kids until we know and understand ourselves. And how about those soft drinks in our fridge? Perhaps this. is their gloomy future. Perhaps sugary drinks, like smoking, we need to make socially unacceptable. I'd just like to leave you with one last message from Neil Hansel from his hospital bed the day after his left leg was amputated.
I had a little joke the other day, and I put my hand up and I had a grain of sugar between my fingers, and I said, "Meet my killer." And people were trying to see what was in my fingers, and all it was 1 grain of salt, 1 grain of sugar. And that's what it takes. You know, we, as a society, we have to do something. We've got to make people aware that the more sugar we intake, the worse this is going to get. And it's not good. It's not good.
No, it's not good, is it? As an eye specialist, I never want to see another patient going needlessly blind due to their diabetes. As a doctor, you should be seeing the life-changing and life-threatening complications of a disease which is entirely preventable. And as Australians, I truly believe it's time to put an end to type 2 diabetes. Thank you very much. So I'll stop sharing the screen now.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you, James. What fantastic, amazing work that you're doing, and I'm sure you'll all agree that that James is an extremely worthy choice as Australian of the Year. Okay, I'm just, where is it? Sorry. Oh, sorry about that. I forgot my camera wasn't on. So, yeah, so again, thank you very much, James. And I'm sure you'll all agree that there are certainly some simple ways that we can, simple changes that we can all make to our dietary habits to help with our future health and maybe kick some of those addictions. I'll put my hand up first. And just a reminder for those who have some questions to put those in through the chat room for our Q&A session at the end. But now we'll move on, and I'd like to introduce to you WA's own Professor John Newnham AM. John is recognised as one of the world's leading authorities in the prevention of preterm birth, the single greatest cause of death and disability in children up to 5 years of age. A professor of obstetrics, John has been instrumental in making WA an international hotspot for research and clinical excellence in pregnancy and life before birth. Over 30 years ago, John founded and led the pioneering RAIN study, the world's first and most enduring pregnancy-focused lifetime cohort project. He developed a pioneering program for preventing preterm birth, which resulted in a huge reduction in premature births across WA. After a successful national rollout in 2018, John founded the Australian Preterm Birth Prevention Alliance, the world's first ever national program of its kind. He's been described by the world's leading scientific journal as an intellectual leader of modern obstetrics who has changed the practice of medicine and the lives of women and infants. Please welcome Professor John Newnham AM, the 2020 Senior Australian of the Year.
Thank you. I think you can all hear me. So thank you very much, and thank you to Auspire for initiating this, and Chevron for being a sponsor of the Australian of the Year. And James, thank you for that most wonderful talk, and also for your great leadership in bringing this to so much attention. What I'm going to talk about today is my perspective of this as an obstetrician who's very interested in life before birth and how events before birth impact us for the rest of our lives. And the origin of type 2 diabetes and obesity, because they go together, well and truly has its origin before birth, and in fact going back several generations in us as humans. And this is now the basis of a whole field of medicine, and the field is called, it's got this world's worst name, it's called Developmental Origins of Health and Disease, and it's abbreviated to DOHAD. So this is actually a DOHAD talk by a DOHAD-er. I was very privileged to be on the original council that formed DOHAD in 2000. And Australia is very big in DOHAD. The RAIN study, which is the lifetime cohort study we started in Western Australia in 1989, the children are now 30 years of age, is a DOHAD study investigating this, and has contributed heavily to the stories I'm about to tell you. India has contributed heavily to it. as is the UK and the United States. In Australia, there's a lot of research that goes on in Adelaide, your town, James, Melbourne, in New Zealand, Auckland, as well as our work in Perth. So a lot of people in Australia are working on this. And what I'm going to do now in the next 15 minutes is give you a potted summary of what this story is all about. And my slides aren't moving. Right, this is the next slide. So global prevalence of diabetes. Now, this is worldmapper.org. And if you're interested in any disease or some condition involving humans, you can go onto this website. And it portrays nations by the size of the problems. So if you look at this, at the total number of people with diabetes, you can see India and China are just major epicenters of this. And so much of the story I'm about to tell you has actually come out of research in India. In 1980, there were 108 million people in the world with diabetes. By 2014, it was 422 million. 75% of these people are in low and middle class income countries. When I was young, it was thought that undernutrition would become the problem of the world. It's not undernutrition, it's overnutrition. China has 110 million people living with diabetes today, and it's rising very rapidly. Now, India is said to have 69 million, but it's believed that it's well over 100 million. The doubling time of this condition is probably about 20 to 25 years. So if you fast forward by 30, 40, 50 years, diabetes looks like it's going to be the first true pandemic in humans that is going to overwhelm the economies of nations. So even though we're all terribly worried about COVID-19 right now, the reality is the pandemic that's going to bring down nations is diabetes. So the question is, why are so many people now diabetic? And the story of sugar, which James has told, is obviously crucially important, but there's a lot more to the story than that. And that is that there's a pre-birth origin to it. Now, this man whose picture's up here is David Barker, who's actually the great nephew of Winston Churchill. And he was a cardiologist. He's recently passed away, working in the UK. And he was trying to explain why heart disease rates were rising and falling in England, why they'd peaked and then were falling. And he thought it must be a lot more to this than sugar, smoking, and cholesterol. And what he did was he published these two very famous graphs, and he published them in the same year that we started our study in Perth, the RAIN study. He went back and got the birth records of people born in England in the first part of the last century and found this correlation between being of low birth weight and having a high risk of heart disease when you're an adult. What he didn't notice was at the time that there's this tick up on the right-hand side. So this shows women and men. In fact, it's U-shaped, and I'll return to that in a minute. I'm now going to introduce you to a concept. So if you're having your lunch and you're eating a sandwich right now, just concentrate very hard for the next few slides, because this is the meaning of life I'm about to tell you, and we've worked it out now collectively, and everybody's very comfortable with it. It began with this story called the thrifty phenotype hypothesis. Now, in medicine, the word thrifty means low caloric intake, low food intake, and a high exercise level, giving you a thin body shape. And phenotype is the medical word for your body shape. So thrifty phenotype hypothesis describes this. And here it is. So concentrate on this sentence. That is, we now know a pregnant woman programs her fetus, her unborn child, for the metabolic world she is living and which it is expected her child will live. So a baby just doesn't grow independently of the mother. The mother is heavily programming this baby for the world in which she's living. And these messages alter the DNA. It's called epigenetics. It turns on and off the DNA in our messaging system. It's called epigenetics. So these messages come down to the child primarily from the mother, but are also influenced from the previous generations. In a rat, which we know the most about, it's a 3-generation story. So here's how it works. So we have all come from a traditional life, a life of thrift. For us with a European background, our life of thrift was many hundreds of years ago and many generations ago. For many people living in our society, life of thrift was 1 generation ago. So that life of thrift that our ancestors all experienced was low nutrition and high exercise. We are now all living on this luncheon a modern life, a life of plenty, which is defined as high nutrition and low exercise level. And what determines our risk of developing obesity and diabetes is the speed at which, somebody's got their microphone unmuted. And what determines our risk of obesity and diabetes is the speed at which our ancestors have made the transition from thrift to plenty. So if the transition has been made slowly, which for most of us Europeans is the case, our predisposition is low. If the transition has been made very rapidly, like in Indigenous Australians, many people coming to our country from Africa or Pacific Islands, if the transition is fast, then you have a very high predisposition to obesity and type 2 diabetes. So the speed of transition from thrift to plenty in our family line is the key feature of it. Now we understand exactly what it is that's causing this. So we now know the mechanism. And if you are programmed for thrift, the things that program you for thrift work against you if you find yourself in a world of plenty. Imagine this. If you were to be born into Central Australia, just outside Alice Springs, 1,000 years ago, what would you want to be able to survive? Where you're born into a world of thrift. You're not going to eat a lot of food. You're going to have to exercise a lot to get that food. So you are programmed before birth to be adapted to that world. You're born thin, you stay thin, you have an upregulated appetite system. So you have a high appetite. And that's due to a hormone we know called leptin. So you're programmed to have a high appetite. You're programmed to have an altered satiety. So if you see food, you're going to eat a lot of it because you're only going to see it every few days. And then if you get excess food, you're going to lay it down as fat. That's called insulin resistance. So you are adapted to live in that world. If you suddenly find yourself living in central Melbourne in 2020, surrounded by money and shops, those things that adapted you to live in Central Australia 1,000 years ago are now going to work against you. You're going to eat a lot of food. You're going to lay it down as fat. You're insulin resistant. You're going to become diabetic. And that's called the thrifty phenotype hypothesis. So we now know that your prevalence of future obesity and diabetes, if you plot it out against birth weight, is a U-shaped curve. So on the left is the person programmed for thrift. I'll return to the right in a minute. I'll turn to the right now. So on the right is the story about if you're born of high birth weight. And this is if your mother has diabetes. So if your mother has pregnancy diabetes or regular diabetes, more glucose crosses over to the unborn baby. The insulin that lowers the glucose cannot cross. The baby makes too much of its own insulin. It becomes fat. It becomes insulin resistant. Its pancreas will become exhausted. And this child is set up to become obese as an adolescent and as a young adult and to go on to develop diabetes. So the U-shaped curve of birth weight against diabetes and obesity, on the left is being programmed for thrift, and on the right are the consequences of diabetes. So how does this story all work? What's happening on planet Earth today? The next slides show you the reason why the world has experienced its biggest pandemic. And that is the affluence of people suddenly moving from a world of thrift to a world of plenty, acting through the thrifty phenotype hypothesis, causes obesity and diabetes. And when these young women become pregnant, they're more likely to develop gestational diabetes, pregnancy diabetes. Their blood sugars go up, and that leads to obesity and diabetes in their offspring. And then when those girls get pregnant, they're more likely to have gestational diabetes. So this is fueling an ever-increasing exponential increase in diabetes. And that's the explanation. Now, this slide is the graph that everybody was waiting for. We didn't know how to get it, but the people in Toronto came up with it. So put your sandwich down again and concentrate on this because this is very important. This slide shows your risk of getting diabetes in the next 5 years if you don't have diabetes as an adult. On the vertical axis is the number of people who are going to develop diabetes. And on the horizontal axis is your body mass index. In other words, as you put on fat, what is your chance of developing diabetes? So now look at the bottom graph, which is white people, European people, which is many of us on this luncheon. So if you are white and you have a BMI of 30, your chance of developing diabetes in the next 5 years is 11%. Now, if you look at the blacks, Chinese, and South Asians are India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh in the medical literature, you can see how the thrifty phenotype hypothesis completely changes their predisposition to diabetes, such that if you were to take somebody, to take the white person with a BMI of 30 and say, okay, that person's chance of getting diabetes in the next 5 years is 11%. If you're black, you have to have a BMI of 26. If you're Chinese, 25. And if you're Indian, 24 to have the same risk. If you look up here at being Indian, if you have a BMI of 30 and you're Indian, your chance of developing diabetes in the next 5 years is 40%. In other words, in the next 10 years, you're going to get diabetes. And this explains why we can see very obese white people, including pregnant white people, who do not have diabetes. But if you see an Indian person with obesity, that you can be certain they're diabetic. China, where I do a lot of work, I've got 2 appointments in China, their incidence of pregnancy diabetes has gone from 2% to 20% in 20 years. And this is what's happening. And so a Chinese person with a BMI of 25 has a very high risk of having abnormal sugar tolerance during pregnancy. So that's a very important thing. So not everybody's predisposition is the same. And so this gives the opportunity to target those sort of public health messages, because targeted public health messages are more effective than blanket public health messages. So I'm going to finish with this. I've introduced you to the basic concepts of how we understand why different racial groups and people's different family ancestral lines give you a completely different predisposition to obesity and diabetes. There's far more to the story than just this. And our colleagues in India have done an immense amount of the work on this. And you can read it all. It's in our medical journals, in the Lancet, etc. But it comes down to this. What is wrong with this image? What is wrong about living in this? Now, this looks like the homes we have or we aspire to have. And what is it about being transported from a world of thrift to live in this family room that is so predisposing to developing obesity and diabetes? Well, in the interest of time, I'll give you the answer. So the first thing are the chairs. So sitting down is a very, very bad thing to do. And we know this. There were the earliest studies done on the London buses. The same sort of people went in to work for the London bus companies. Some got allocated to be drivers. Some got allocated to be conductors and go up and down the stairs in the two-story buses all day. And it quickly became evident a long time ago, 40, 50 years ago, that the drivers got heart attacks and the bus conductors didn't. So we know chairs, we know sitting is one of our enemies. TV and the telephone is one of the things that keeps us seated. So TV and telephone is acting against us. The next is the ceiling. The ceiling is one of our enemies. And there's been a strong correlation between vitamin D levels, which we get from sunlight, and risk of diabetes. But it's not just the vitamin D. There are other things in sunlight that are preventing us from getting diabetes, because many of the vitamin D trials are negative. It doesn't work as well as we thought it did. Vitamin D is heavily a surrogate for the fact we're not getting enough sunlight. And we know what the element in sunlight is that's preventing us from getting diabetes. It's a chemical that acts on blood vessels called nitric oxide. The next is the humble refrigerator. And this is not so important in Australia, but very important in India, where 60% of people are functionally vegetarian. And if you leave your vegetables out in the sun, as it used to be, there was bacterial degradation from the sunlight, which produced a vitamin called vitamin B12. And so vegetarian Indians have a high folic acid level from their green vegetables, and they need vitamin B12. They put their vegetables in the fridge, there's no vitamin B12, and that imbalance causes diabetes and heart disease. The next is cleanliness. So our excessive cleanliness, although that's not a diabetes story, that's an asthma story. But the plastics is the other great story, which I don't have time to talk about today. But in our RAIN study, we've shown that high plastic levels in unborn children, in other words, the cord blood, correlate with lots of things in adulthood. One of the things being the sperm count in young men. So plastics are estrogenic. And so our exposure to plastics is another issue for another day. So what I've tried to do very quickly in 15 minutes is take you through the DOHAD story, the origins of health and disease in humans as it relates to obesity and diabetes. The story is heavily pinned on sugar, but also is heavily pinned on family ancestral line. And so we all need to consider, where are we on this list of predisposition? So I'd like to thank you very much for listening to me for this period of time, and I very much look forward to our question time. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you very much, John. We're extremely proud to have a WA recipient in these prestigious national awards, and you're undoubtedly a fine ambassador for our state and the work being carried out here and throughout the world, that you bring us that information. So thank you very much. Two great presentations. Now, we've received some questions through the chat room, and please excuse me when I read them, because we want to make sure that we capture them for you. And one of the questions is asked, do I need to be concerned about the sugar in vegetables? This person says they usually have a small amount of sweet vegetables every day, such as sweet potato, carrot, corns, etc. So what are the concerns with those type of vegetables?
I think that's for James. James, you're muted.
James.
There we go. Sure, I think vegetables vary, of course. So you have some low starch vegetables such as broccoli, spinach, cauliflower, which are carbohydrates, but nutrient dense carbohydrates. And then you have some sweeter vegetables, and then you have the highly refined potatoes, white potatoes, for example. So I think really it's just a matter of where you are on that spectrum. If you have insulin resistance, if you have pre-diabetes, or if you have type 2 diabetes, you just need to be careful about what you're eating. And in terms of vegetables, if you don't have insulin resistance or pre-diabetes, then probably can eat most vegetables quite comfortably, but as you go up that scale towards type 2 diabetes, you should be more careful about what you eat, and particularly the sweeter vegetables. But I think in general day-to-day consumption, moderation and a variety of vegetables and fruits is not a bad idea. You have to unmute, sorry, Anne-Marie. You may as well stay unmuted.
Oh, okay. A question I have here for John is, can we reverse the imprints that we've made on children if we have had a high sugar diet whilst pregnant?
Yes, you can. And it's exactly as the data that James showed. So very important to know, if you've had gestational diabetes, that I didn't have time to talk about prevention, but the most important thing about gestational diabetes is to make sure your blood sugar levels stay normal. If your blood sugar levels are normal throughout pregnancy, there's not a problem. It's only if your blood sugar levels are elevated. And that's why all Australian hospitals, obstetric hospitals, have diabetes clinics, and we meticulously control people's blood sugar levels. So if your blood sugar levels are controlled, your child should not be at risk. Having said that, you can reduce the risk with exercise and diet. And that's a very important part of personalised medicine, to understand what your risk is. So if a child has come from a pregnancy with gestational diabetes, they're at risk. But you can ameliorate this with exercise and diet. And exactly the same if you look at your family ancestral line. You can alter the outcome of this progression.
Another question we have here, and this might be, well, for either, but possibly James, how much damage to the liver is and other organs is reversible once the process of destruction has begun?
So a fatty liver, and so a fatty pancreas is also central to this. So once we start to get fat infiltration to all of the intra-abdominal organs, that's when we start to see the metabolic dysfunction. So once you actually have fat infiltration of the pancreas, then you start to see a drop in production in insulin relatively, and that's why the blood sugar then starts to rise, and that's when we start to see pre-diabetes and then type 2 diabetes. So it's not actually, you've not destroyed, in those early stages, you certainly haven't destroyed the pancreas and you haven't destroyed the liver. It's just a dysfunction which is reversible. I'm not sure at what point, but certainly at some point, and particularly when people start to get complications of their diabetes, such as damage to their eyes and damage to their kidneys and so forth. Of course, that's not reversible, but certainly the fatty infiltration of the liver and pancreas is a reversible situation, and that's why I think even at any point in time in the spectrum of pre-diabetes through to type 2 diabetes, then you have the opportunity to limit the sugar, limit the refined carbohydrates, limit the highly processed foods in your diet, and certainly that will help to really prevent the severe life-threatening, life-changing complications of this disease.
Sure. A question we've got is, what is the difference between type 1 and type 2 diabetes?
So type 1 is actually an autoimmune disease. I mentioned before, I think that maturity onset diabetes was the name of type 2 diabetes, and juvenile onset diabetes was type 1 diabetes. So the type 1 diabetes in younger people, but even we're starting to see it in older people now as well. But it's an autoimmune disease, and that does cause destruction of the pancreas, and that's why you get a drop in insulin, and if it's untreated, it's a deadly disease. Whereas type 2 diabetes is also due to, as I mentioned before, dysfunction of the pancreas, fatty liver, fatty pancreas, but it's a different mechanism. It's not due to that autoimmune destruction. It is due to that fatty infiltration, which is then potentially reversible. Thank
you. A question for you, John, and that is a question about older age mothers and the influence that might have on the incidence of diabetes. Is that a factor?
Oh, yes. So gestational diabetes, pregnancy diabetes, is heavily influenced by the age of the mother. So as in the old days, we only used to test women who are 35 years and older, but we now do glucose testing on every pregnant woman. But still, being older is definitely an increased risk. It does not mean bad things for the outcome, though. It's all manageable, and it's manageable with exercise. This disease, type 2 diabetes, is insulin resistance at your cellular level. And when you exercise, you turn around insulin resistance that day. You can measure it that day. So insulin resistance is completely altered by exercise. You don't have to sprint, you just have to go for a good walk. So exercise is crucial. And then dietary management, and if you still have elevated blood sugar levels, we put you on insulin to maintain your glucose levels. So yes, as you get older, your risk of diabetes goes up, but this is all very manageable, but it does take work.
The other important thing just to note, John and Anne-Marie and the listeners, is the role of fasting in this. And I mentioned before, and John talked about periods of fasting where we weren't eating particularly sugar and storing sugar as a reserve. So when you fast, there's some very significant metabolic changes that happen. And even a short-term fast, so what I do a 16-8 fast, so after dinner through till lunchtime the next day, I don't eat for 16 hours. And even in that short period of time, you get a sudden drop in insulin, and it's the high insulin level, which is one of the biggest drivers of weight gain, because it is involved in that process of converting glucose into fat by the liver. So when you fast, you get a drop in insulin, so you get weight loss. You also get a rise in growth hormone and a rise in adrenaline. So those metabolic changes are actually really important. And so one of the really important management tools, I believe, in type 2 diabetes is fasting. And it's something that needs to be done in conjunction with the endocrinologist and the GP, particularly if you're on medication, because you can't suddenly start fasting, your insulin level drops and you can suddenly be in strife. So it's important to do that in conjunction with the treating physician. Actually, also something I wanted to mention from John's paper, I think the women who breastfeed for longer, their children have lower risk of type 2 diabetes. Isn't that correct, John?
Yep, that's correct. Yeah.
I've got a question here from Rabia. Thank you, Rabia. Rabia said thanks to you both very much for such an interesting presentation. And her question relates to childhood obesity. A friend of hers has 2 young children under 10, and both of them have BMIs in the 99th percentile. And she's not accepting this could cause long-term health and emotional problems for the children. What steps could be recommended that she takes once and for all to start addressing the issue? And she means the kids are active and eating a balanced diet.
I suspect that they're not eating a balanced diet. I suspect they're having, maybe they're not having excessive sugary drinks, but I suspect that they're having a lot of refined carbohydrates. There's probably this, the thrifty phenotype hypothesis at play here as well. But I would have thought there are a number of factors in childhood obesity and childhood type 2 diabetes, one of which is, significantly limiting their intake of sugar and refined carbohydrates. The exercise component is really important. But I think also one of the things which I mentioned in my presentation about addiction and alleviation, kids are probably not aware that they're addicted to sugar and probably not aware that they're using it to alleviate stress. But we also need to protect the environment of children and also people who are addicted. So when someone's addicted to something, and as I mentioned, sugar is highly addictive, you need to protect that person. You need to reduce the environmental cues to that addiction, and quite simply that means also limiting their exposure to having sugary products in the house, being aware of the amount of added sugar in the products that are in the pantry or in the fridge, hopefully not having exposure to ads on TV, not having those checkout counters which are all aimed at kids. You've got to run the gauntlet of those checkout counters with your kids, and you're just bombarded with sugary treats. Even going to office supply stores, you see this as well. So it's very hard to get away from it. And this is why I think there's a significant responsibility of industry and business to help in this process. Also a very important responsibility of the government to help to start raising awareness, educational strategies at school, and then we go on to school tuck shops. So there's a lot just in this space. It's not one single simple measure.
I've got a question myself here, and that is, if with so many of us having maybe an addiction to sugar, if the replacements are found for that and introduced, what will replace it, and will those replacements provide health risks?
Well, a good question. Well, you don't need to replace it. There's no biochemical process in the body that... Well, so there's no biochemical process in the body that demands that we eat sugar. You can actually get all the glucose you need from fat and protein, interestingly. So it really depends whether you want to, and there's several layers of detoxing. I call it detoxing from sugar. So for me, what I did was simply give up the really heavily sugared products, the chocolate, confectionery, fruit juices, soft drinks, ice cream, cakes, biscuits, things like that. And even that does cause withdrawal symptoms. So what you're noticing when if you're feeling like you need that sugar hit or you need that sweet fix is simply a withdrawal mechanism of your detox or your winding down from that drug, which is sugar. And so you need that kick, you need that hit again. But for me, it took about 3 days. Some people it can take longer to get over those cravings, to get over the symptoms of sugar withdrawal, which is headaches, irritability, clouded thoughts, even fatigue. And for me, they were quite strong, much stronger than coffee withdrawal. But once you get through that process, and I took a few Panadols here and there, and I got through that process, and you don't then have that absolute craving for sugar that sometimes we feel. So it really is just a matter of managing that. Firstly, being aware that that's the situation, avoiding using sugars to reward yourself, and particularly avoid using it when you're feeling stressed. Go for a walk, listen to music, do other things rather than going for that sugar hit to give you that feel-good kick. So there are definitely a number of strategies there, and that in itself is a big topic of discussion. There's lots of books and apps to help through that process, but I think these are all very important.
A question for John about Carolina would like to know where she can read more about the thrifty phenotype hypothesis.
Okay, so I've written all of this up in as a review article, and I will send it to you, Anne-Marie.
Okay.
And it's written hopefully for the general public to be able to read. So I'll send it to you. It's an extensive review of this whole field. So I'll send it to Anne-Marie. So if you could contact Anne-Marie, she will send it to you.
Okay.
It's absolutely fascinating. John sent it to me a few weeks ago, and it was a really interesting reading. And John, it was a little bit scary to me. There's obviously a big vegetarian and vegan movement, but the concern is with vegetarian that you might have a reduced folate, and that in itself can trigger a potential risk of diabetes.
But reduced B12 in the presence of high folate. Yeah. So that's what's happening. That's what's happening in India. So India's diabetes explosion is just unbelievable, and that would apply to any Australian person of Indian origin. You need to realise you're exquisitely programmed for type 2 diabetes, and there's a lot of work to be done. I just, if we're getting near to the end of time, I would just like to say, I, like so many people like me, I was involved in ACOSH, the Australian Council on Smoking and Health, like 25 years ago when the war was being waged against tobacco companies. I was not a frontline soldier, but I was doing my bit as an obstetrician in the background. But the campaign that was waged very heavily aiming to reduce cigarette intake, to stop advertising at the point of sale, plain packaging labelling, and then those photos on the packages. I mean, that's worked. That's lowered Australia's smoking rate enormously. It would seem to me that the sugar campaign is going to take that tobacco campaign, but more, because it is actually harder. I think it's harder because we didn't have children addicted to cigarettes at the time, or not many. This is a bigger campaign, and there are big forces out there in the sugar industry who are going to be campaigning against it. Also, politicians are not heavily motivated to be on side because a tax on sugar is a tax on the poor, we keep hearing. So I think that it's going to take World War III to be successful. Somebody eventually is going to have to put their hand up to be the frontline soldier leading the rest. In Western Australia, it was Mike Dawe was the person who led the charge on this, and Mike Dawe became West Australian of the Year for this, became Director General of Health, and has been profoundly effective. But to take on sugar is an even bigger fight than Mike Dawe had. So, James, I'm thrilled that you're Australian of the Year, because you're going to be well placed to get on a big white horse, draw your sword and charge, because that's what it's going to take.
As long as they don't end the year in concrete boots.
That's it. Well, one of the questions that we have leading on from that is do you have a petition that we could sign to show our support for the cause to remove advertising from such items, from sugar-filled items? So, is there something that we can all just do our little bit and sign a petition to help with that?
It's not something I'd thought of. How one even goes about getting a national petition, it's not something I've been aware of, but it's something to think about, that's for sure. I actually presented to a group of parliamentarians who are on side, so I was really preaching to the converted, so to speak. But what we need is, I'm rounding up at the moment a group of people to present to Greg Hunt the latest evidence, because I think ultimately what they need is the latest evidence, because this is all been heavily conflicted by industry and vested interests and ideology and so forth. It's a really murky space, as John alluded to. So we need the clarity, and we need someone brave up there who's going to take it on in government, who's going to make this change. And it's, as John said, it's much like smoking, but we've had a love affair with sugar for over 300 years now. Sugar is inherently a pleasant thing to do. I don't like smoking, but I love sugar. And so it's a really tricky thing. And I'm under no false pretenses that this is going to take a long, long time. It's not going to happen in this year. But already I've had a win in terms of changing the dietary guidelines to reduce refined carbohydrates and sugary products in those guidelines, and to also support the very important role of natural saturated fats in our diet, which are very important to our health.
Well, thank you both for your time. I think we have to wrap up, and we hope that the causes that are so close to your heart, that the Australian of the Year platform has given a little bit more opportunity to share those messages and your thoughts and expertise on that. This Inspiring Australians Lunch with Leaders series is just one of the many initiatives our small team delivers year-round. Others include events, programs and campaigns working with individuals, schools and local communities to promote, support and build capacity for social cohesion, cultural inclusion and leadership in civics and citizenship. And we'd be more than happy to help share those messages about health-related issues that you've brought to us today. So that's all we have time for today. I thank each and every one of you for joining us. And once more, we thank Chevron for supporting this initiative. And again, I encourage you all to please nominate someone who inspires you for the Australian of the Year Awards. Thank you again, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Inspiring Australians Lunch with Leaders event in September. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Anne-Marie.
Thank you.